Welcome to the Hamilton Region SR&ED Practitioners Workshop. Today I'm hosting the session along with Dr. Russ Roberts of CADA and Dominic Iannone of the Canada Revenue Agency. We're going to start the discussion with changes in federal science and technology funding. This includes a review of a survey and discussion of science and policy issues not specifically addressed in any of the various government reports to date. It includes recommendations on CRA's administration of the program and discusses some new ideas on commercialization as discussed in the budget and other programs. So a recap of some of the information from the end of last year is that there's been a series of reports starting with the Jenkins expert panel, actually entitled Innovation Canada Call to Action, which the federal government plans on implementing the recommendations of over the next couple years. There's additional reports from University of Toronto, C.D. Howe Institute of Pricewaterhouse, and the Canadian Advanced Technology Association, their spokesperson, Sir Terry Matthews. We're going to refer to all those presentations and reports throughout the analysis here in our survey. The common recommendations are to move some of the SR&ED tax credit funding to some other types of support, to consider refundability to all claimants, large and foreign companies, to consider paying credits on only labor costs, and an idea brought out by CADA is perhaps to reduce the filing deadline from 18 to 6 months. Some other non-science and technology or non-SR&ED issues, but related to science and technology, include new funding and resources for commercialization, promoting clustering or expansion of certain industries or sectors that are seen as beneficial or have more promise, streamlining government, and adjusting some government purchasing and immigration policies to prioritize SR&ED. Some of the methods that they're using to create entrepreneurial advantage will be establishing lower tax rate in large-scale research and development centers, to have private sector identify and lead new research. They're going to identify key sectors or areas of interest for social and economic knowledge advantage, and to make sure you can attract and maintain the right people, to reduce personal income taxes and promote immigration. Some of the principles that they talk about in administering the funding from a government perspective are enhancing accountability, increasing competition or promoting competition, focusing on priorities or areas of strength, and encouraging partnerships between business, academic, and government, both internationally and abroad. So given that preamble, we're going to discuss some of the issues that have been brought up in the public and in private as to where the science and technology funding should take place and how it should be accomplished by the government.
Globe and Mail talks about, one article was titled "Flawed R&D costs scheme cost taxpayers billions." And basically it said that 1/3 of all the billions of dollars that the government gives each year is going to consultants such as ourselves. Where are you getting out of that? Like, man, I'd love to charge my clients 1/3, but particularly the big clients, the big public companies, that claim the majority of expenses, I don't think they're paying 1/3 of their amounts in consulting fees. So that was way off. They talk about the net benefits of every dollar. We'll talk about some of these things. Which industries get the money, that CRA risk controls aren't working, and ultimately that credits don't work, it should all be given to grants or other kind of direct funding, is the argument the Globe and Mail article was making. That we should focus on clusters and really let the politicians pick who the clusters are at the end of the day, which is a little bit of a dangerous situation there, but we'll see how that works out. So after looking at all these reports and the recommendations, what I did is a survey, and I got roughly 150, 160 responses from people, practitioners mostly such as yourself, about what are your feelings on these recommendations? Do you agree, disagree, or have no opinion? And I found some issues were very polarized, and other people really didn't care at all. So Refunding ITCs to large and foreign companies, and I rounded it roughly to the nearest 5 to 10% in here. Approximately 70% of respondents said they thought that was a good idea if it was done properly, but there needed to be a little more discussion about how that would work. Concentrating on 4 key industry clusters, the majority of people felt they didn't really care. People who were in the industries that were chosen thought it was a great idea, I found, on average, and people who were in industries who weren't chosen thought it was a bad idea, but as practitioners, we said, well, that's more of an economic issue. I'm not skilled enough to really have an opinion on that. So again, kind of an ambiguity there that really didn't tip one way or the other. Restricting eligible costs to labor only versus materials and capital. This is one of the ones where originally people didn't agree. There was originally only 40% agreement, but people who gave their names on the questionnaires that didn't fill it out anonymously often followed up with more questions on them. And I said, let's rephrase that. If we had to cut something, something's got to go. Should we reduce the rate, or should we concentrate on other kinds of reasons for this, like materials or capital? And really the corollary here is consider the payment of wages a hedge transaction. If I pay ITCs on wages, the only way you can get more money is to pay more wages, which means you pay more withholding tax. If we look at the average tax rate, or say the tax rate for someone earning over $60,000, they're paying at least 40 to 45% of every dollar they earn in taxes. So every dollar I pay that employee, 45 cents on the dollar goes to CRA coffers, especially top marginal rate, 46 cents on the dollar. And the vast majority of claimants are only 20%ers, so they're only getting 20% of that money back, maybe 30% if we factor in proxy overhead. So to pay more wages actually automatically puts more money in the government's pocket than it will ever pay me back in R&D credits. Whereas paying credits on materials that are sourced abroad didn't create any government revenue or capital, or subcontractors in particular, that could completely bankrupt the system. It's not a hedge transaction, so it's not as easy to budget for. So I think there's a lot of merit to say, in the Quebec example, they say, we want high-tech employment here in Quebec. We don't care where you buy your materials. We don't care where you buy your capital. We'd rather pay you double on wages, so you pay your employees more, which will cause those employees to stay here, which will create more R&D in our environment, and they're right. It's worked. So again, when we talk about it like that, people say, well, I don't think they should cut anything, but if they have to cut something, yes, I think it makes more sense to deal with the materials and capital issues than wages, and maybe increase the credit on the wages. So again, something easy for the CRA to review. They've got the T4 slips. They know exactly how much the employee made during the year. It's a nice, simple process for them to review via the desk and ensure that they're collecting more in tax revenue than they're paying out. I mean, it's arguable that a CCPC could get a little more back if someone's 100% R&D, but the CCPCs as a percent of total claimants are so small, they're less than 1/3 of the total claims, and the amount that we're talking about there is very insignificant. So for all intents and purposes, by paying on wages like Quebec does, you have a really neat hedge transaction that's easy for finance to predict what the effects are going to be. So again, everyone seemed to have an opinion on this, but it was flexible. We could shift it back and forth with more discussion. That lets me think we should discuss this more till we get some consensus and everyone's comparing the same basis on that. Shifting funding from SR&ED credits to direct grants, procurement, whatever, is an interesting point. Nobody really agreed with this, but then again, I'm talking to SR&ED practitioners, so how objective are we? There was maybe 5% of people who thought there was some merit for that, but the vast majority said no. We'll talk about this a little further and maybe look at how other countries are doing it. Some of the things that I found on talking to people and listening to some of the reasons for it were one that, if you look at the Jenkins report itself, it talked about the programs, and they said we looked at 500 and something claimants who we polled, or 500 and something technology companies, of which 78% claimed SR&ED, so roughly 80% of the market, and 17% claimed Irap, and no other government funding group had more than 1% penetration. And what they said is Irap is the only federal program that works for SR&ED, and it's only less than 1/4 as effective or accepted as the SR&ED program. And I would say in practice, I'm surprised it's even that high. I have, the majority of my clients would qualify for Irap, as many of yours would, and each client will tell me the specific reasons why they'll never deal with Irap again. Irap and SR&ED are two completely different kinds of funding areas. And one's really a grant where they choose to give you the money on whatever reasons they want, and one's your right as a taxpayer. One comes with all kinds of hooks on it, like you can't sell the rights outside of Canada for 5 years, you can't have started the project, you can only have one project at once, and so forth and ongoing. You have to do a business plan and explain how you're going to market your company, and now I have business owners sitting there saying, why do I have to explain my business plan to a government employee? If this person knew anything about business, they wouldn't be working for Irap trying to do business plans. And it gets into a vicious cycle, and it always ends badly. 90% of the time, it ends badly. So the idea that maybe we should shift more money to that non-performing segment seems to get a huge backlash. Well, so the point is Irap doesn't just fund SR&ED, but I would say that Irap's funding is SR&ED related. So the marketing and stuff, you have to have a previously approved Irap project technologically, and then they'll give you money to market or commercialize that after the fact, as opposed to non-technology related events. Good point, though. Okay. Reduce the filing deadline from 6 to 18 months. This, again, when I talked to more people, they started to agree. And I was surprised how many people actually agreed off the bat that maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. I thought that would have a huge backlash. But, you know, if I say, hey, we've got to cut some costs, it'll cut 1/3, 30 to 40% of CRA review resources, which they say are short-strung, and avoid a lot of the conflicts. Maybe that's a good way to do it. Maybe we have to get rid of the bad students at some point. So that might be something, like I said, that CATA threw in kind of after all the other reports came out that no one else mentioned. But the more I think about it, you know, if we're fiscally responsible and we have to cut something, that may be a neat overhead method, and probably accepted more than any other method from the claimant.
You're assuming that the people who claim in the following 12 months are just going to drop off the table, as opposed to doing bad claims faster.
I'm not assuming anything. I'm just saying statistically, what the CRA is saying is the claims that are done later, on average, are worse. And that's intuitive. Sorry, Russ, go ahead. Okay. And then an interesting one that came out, whether the CRA should continue to administer the program or have some new National Research Council or other based entity to deal with the technology side. And I said, well, that's an interesting proposal because a lot of people are upset at the CRA. But then I thought about it, and the majority of claimants think the CRA should still do it. We're not saying they're doing a perfect job, but what's the corollary? If we go more like the Irap or funding thing, and they say, you've got a great project, but we're just out of money. We're sorry, come back next year. You have no rights. Or, we just don't like you because my cousin over here needs the money. I mean, I would hate to say that there's graft or corruption, but think of a Canadian Prime Minister who hasn't been accused of giving money to his friends or improper allocation of government funds. It's pretty much a given that as soon as you get in office, you're charged with this. And they're probably right. So if it happens at the highest level, it happens at every level. There's very little accountability or reportability because you have no rights to this. It's fully discretionary. Yes? Well, at my point, I'm going to say here, like I say, we could say that the prime ministers don't give jobs to their friends, and they would never admit that either, but the fact is they've all been accused of it with good evidence. Okay? If the prime ministers can do it, I would say an Irap guy could do it as well because there's not the accountability under law. There's no courts. If you say no, absolutely. Moving along. Potential methods. Commercialization. So an idea came out later, again from CATA, after the fact, that maybe one of the ways the government says we have to help companies, especially the smaller, medium-sized SMEs, commercialize their product more, not just do the R&D. Helping them just with the R&D isn't enough. It's not really adding value to society at the end of the day if we don't bring that product to commercialization. And one of the ideas that I heard on a CATA stakeholders group was by a big multinational company, and they said, we have a mandate to work with local guys to help us develop the products. And if it's developed, we can, they sell cellular phones, we can sell 4 million units or 5 million units tomorrow around the world. And the government of Canada can't really help us because we're a multinational company. You can do all the incubators and business plans and whatever you want. But this little guy working in his business is never going to sell 5 million copies of anything tomorrow unless they're linked with bigger players like this who can take their stuff and commercialize it. I thought this was a really neat point to make, those kind of strategic partnerships. And he said, we do this just because we think we're good corporate citizens, but if there was some incentive, like refundability of ITCs or enhanced ITCs for doing this kind of work, and encouragement and incentive to actually do it, instead of just doing it because we're good corporate citizens, that would be even better. And I thought about it, and I thought, hey, we could spend lots of money talking about commercialization and small business incubators and doing business plans for little guys, but reality is, if we can hook the big guys up who can commercialize the product with the little guys and give everyone incentives to do this, that might be an interesting avenue, so something that we'll see being addressed. Okay? Getting back to our Irap. My real question would be, if we're going to shift the funding and make it kind of like the Soviet Union or Russia now or US, who are primarily funding based. It's grants or procurements, that's how they give all the money. Tax credits are irrelevant. How many Irap claimants are there to begin with per year? I've tried to find that statistic. It's not published anywhere. The site says thousands. Is that 2,000? 3,000? According to CRA, there's between 25 and 30,000 claimants every year for SR&ED. I'm going to guess there's less than a tenth of the numbers of companies claiming Irap than that, but again, I don't have the statistics. So before you do the shift, why not ask companies, why is there such a huge preference of SR&ED over Irap? Why the preference? Before we make the change, ask the users, why aren't you using this program that we want? Why are you not using the program we want to shift funds to? And should we take funds from the program that you're using to shift them? Yes, Julie? I've invited Irap guys, I invited one time an Irap guy out to speak at one of our presentations, and he basically told us the same thing. We have no business, he doesn't want to talk to us, we can't help in any way. And I thought, why are you even here? You're actually completely confrontational. And I understand that they don't want fees being charged, but they don't understand that the reason the SR&ED program is so successful is there's people encouraging the client to do it. No one's going to encourage their client to do Irap. In fact, there's a disincentive to do it for exactly the reasons that you said. They're confrontational with the assistance of the people that would help them prepare the claim, whether you're charging fees or not. I wasn't going to get into that issue, but from a sales standpoint, I'm happy that clients don't want to do Irap, although I will link them up with the advisors as well. I'll leave it up to their choice. Well, you're seeing the same backlash that you see in the SR&ED right now against consultants. How do consultants charge? How much can consultants make? That Irap more or less cut it out. You can't charge anything. You can't use consultants. You can't get help with consultants. You can't get guidance. We'll do everything for you. We'll think for you. We'll write your projects for you. And again, it's a little bit of a different mandate. But for some of my clients that use it, they're happy with it. They tell me, Dave, it's a big game. We know it's a joke, but if they're giving us money, we'll jump through whatever hoops they want. We'll do the yes or no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. We don't like it, but if there's enough money, people will play that game. I think Irap's got some great ideas. They got mandates to link you with academia, to liaise, and when they do that, it works out great. I can show you some success stories. I'm not saying it's always bad. I'm just that anyone knows about or only consistent one, but any of those programs. Any other comments on that? All right. So anyways, to make a long story short, I posted the letter that I sent to our MP here in Burlington, Mike Wallace, outlining these issues and how we feel on those kinds of things, and he passed it on to Parliament, so we've made all those points public. Some of the issues that we then did not talk about in the survey, or the issues being addressed by the Globe and Mail, is what is the micro versus macroeconomic benefit? This is a big thing, that the government will come in and say, the marginal utility of every dollar of tax that we give up to give you an R&D credit creates value down the road. It'll create new tax revenues and et cetera and so forth. And how much is it? Do we break even? Do we get 5 to 1? Are we falling short? What's the issue? So we'll talk about that. And really what they said in here was that the macroeconomic benefit for every dollar, and there's a series of cases and reports that talk about it, is roughly 1 to 1. So for every dollar invested in tax, you get roughly $1 back. But, and the big but on this one, is that they're saying that's just the tax revenue. That's for every dollar of tax that we give back, how much tax we make off the company from commercially exploiting the product. And they agree that there's 18 studies that say it's roughly 80% to 100, it's roughly a 1-to-1 payback. And there's not just Canadian studies, there's international studies that look at R&D tax credits that they quoted, and that's quite right. But I'm saying that's elusive because that's only part of the picture. The part that they didn't tell you is that the true economic effect is they say that not only is it the company's going to make more money, but it creates more wages and it spins off more companies and allows other people to develop that technology. And the estimated economic effect is therefore 5 to 6 times the marginal utility. They say for every dollar of tax that you make, you actually create more economic value, anywhere from 400 to 1,300%, but say an average of 5 to 6 times. So economists say that for every dollar we put in R&D credits, we get roughly $1 back through the tax system, but the economy gets $5 to $6 back. Now, one of the things is when I presented this to Mike Wallace, he said, well, stop right there on that one. He goes, every industry, you could argue the arts, we've argued that for the art. Every dollar you put in, you get 5 to 10. Every industry who wants money is going to make that argument, so that's not going to get us anywhere. Nonetheless, like I say, it's just something that's being published in the papers that it's really break even, when in reality, And that's a truthful statement. The marginal utility is a break-even as far as tax revenues, but the real payback, the real economic payback, is estimated to be 5 to 6 times. For every dollar you put in, you get $5 to $6 back in the economy. So what they're saying in the papers isn't really the full story. Regulation of fees for consultant support. So we'll defer this to later in the meeting, because I think this topic we'll actually get some more feedback on it, and we'll talk about some things that would affect that. But it's one of the issues that keeps popping up, and as many of you know, there's current studies and feedbacks and negotiations, and Russ will talk a little bit about where that's going from the Ottawa point of view. We'll defer that, like I said, a little later. And one thing that I'd like to talk about is really the international rules, the US versus Canada, and opportunities that I see here, that the IRS is starting to up its claims. Depending what president's going to come in, they both seem favorable to the R&D, particularly President Obama. And if we look at the rules, they're identical. How you write the project descriptions, where we got the rules, the OECD Frascati manual. If we look at 248 sub 1 definition of SR&ED in the Canadian Income Tax Act, carbon copy. If we look at the definition in the IRS code 4841D, again, verbatim what's in the OECD manual, meaning the way you write the project descriptions is ultimately similar. I think there's a good opportunity here, we did it earlier in our courses, to look at some of the examples that the US has published on what's eligible in software. What's eligible for R&D credit in software. We can apply that to Canadian rules, and vice versa, apply the Canadian rules there. The T661 form itself actually says, did you collaborate with any other companies as part of this SR&ED? And you have to fill that out on every project. So it'd be very easy for Canada and the US or any other countries to allow collaborative R&D. To understand that R&D doesn't actually always happen in one country. Sometimes there's international companies, especially with multinational corporations. And to allow a claim to be processed through all of them, maybe joint audit or review procedures, anything like that. I know that CRA has a huge amount of resources of personnel and skilled personnel. And for what I've talked to people who do US claims, they don't really have too much review down there at all. They tend to just send that to subcontractors rather than full-time IRS technical personnel. And they probably don't have the same infrastructure that we have here. So huge opportunities. Again, Mike Wallace thought that was good, but it's really beyond the control of the Canadian government, but something that might happen. All right. So during the RBG seminar that they run each year, there was issues on the CRA's administration of the program itself, both on the technical and the financial eligibility. Some of the issues here were that the refund of ITCs to large and foreign companies, if it's not done, the R&D is moving outside of Canada. So a lot of the claimants favor that idea. And as we said, the collaboration may be a basis or any other basis to determine how and when should large companies, if at all, get refundable credits, particularly if they're in a loss position, to avoid the transfer of that R&D offshore, which is supposedly what's happening right now. All right, to give a quick overview of the stats, the latest stats I have from CRA that are of the $3.3 billion in credits that they handed out in 2004, 2/3 of that money went to 4,000 large and public companies, and the other 1/3 of that went to 20,000 plus small and medium-sized companies. So again, 2/3 of our total investment in R&D credit is really going to the same 4,000 companies, and this number isn't growing. One number is growing at roughly 10% every year, and one number has been stagnant since I can remember, and it's probably not going to go that much higher. Yes? You're right. It's not cash, it's non-refundable credits. Yes? And that's the complaint, I guess, right? That you can't use the credits, so why do the work in Canada? Why don't I go to the US where they're just going to give me a grant to put in a new plant and we'll go from there? Okay, so Feedback on our issue on the clusters. It was mixed response. Like I say, people don't seem to have an opinion on that. The clusters that were identified as priorities are environmental sciences, different sub-priorities, water, clean production, hydrofuels, natural resources and energy, health and related life sciences, and IT, information and communications technologies. So these are going to be the market darlings where I would say you see funding shifting there already, and they're saying this is where the future shift, this is where Canada's future lies. These are the industries that we're most competitive in. Notice there's really not much manufacturing there. According to stats, manufacturing is 48% of all Canadian R&D claims, so the biggest claimant is really the one that they're talking about going by the wayside. Secondary sectors that they might. So they said, well, those are the four we're definitely going to invest in, and these are the ones that show promise. The auto sector, they say, is an enigma. They say it spends the least amount of R&D of any industry compared to its competitors. The Canadian R&D expenditures per company versus US companies, they say, are a fraction, and yet we always get more productivity. Firms like Magma or Linamar or any of those tend to do relatively small amounts of R&D but get huge bang for the bucks and come up with innovative products over and over again. So they're saying they don't spend a lot of R&D, but they get huge results and productivity out of it, and we don't know why. Life sciences, again, great promise, all the right researchers here, but again, mixed results on commercialization. Banking, is they're saying Canadian banks do tremendously well internationally, and they're a key part of our society that they're saying strategically having strong banking is strong for every business. If you have weak banking, no one else can succeed. So they're saying from a security point of view, it's a great idea. And lastly, communication technologies is a primary sector, and other subsets of it are saying that we want to look at banking and communication technologies specifically for the infrastructure side. All right, so like I said, most people said, well, that's economics. I don't really want to comment on that. It's not really SR&ED, but if that's the way it's going, that would tend to influence where our clients are going. The manufacturing sector seems to be shrinking. We'll talk to that about fees. I hear results from different groups saying that North American manufacturing in the last 3 years is down 80%. So if that's 50% of all claimants and their R&D of manufacturing sector is down 80%, that means the SR&ED claims would be down 80% of every manufacturing client on average for the last 3 years, meaning that consultant fees are probably taking a hit at the same time. Yes? Well, I'm not sure that they're talking about removing SR&ED credits. They're talking about reallocating between one sector and another. And they're talking about shifting it from credits to grants, ultimately. And then with grants, you can pick the sector that you want. If you're not in my sector, like I said, even though you're not my cousin, you're not a sector that I like. You don't get the money. That's what the government's priorities have said in 2007, 2009. Manufacturing is not one of those industries that they just listed. I'm not saying I agree with that at all. I'm just saying that's what the government said. I don't know. This, like I said, this is an economic issue I'm not really qualified to comment on. Maybe they're right. Maybe manufacturing's dead. A lot of my clients I see say we can't compete with stuff made in China right now. They're shipping the finished product over for less than we can buy the raw materials here, is what they're saying. It's not even an economic issue anymore. If that's the case, then maybe the government's right. We just got to bite the bullet, and it sucks, but we can't afford it. We're not competitive anymore. We have to move on. I'm not agreeing. I'm merely stating the facts here. I have no opinion on this. I'm of those 50% of people, just like I said. I'm not an economist. This is beyond my scope of what to talk about. I can understand the issues. I understand what they're saying. The economists say that, and I'm saying, well, maybe if the economists are right, maybe that's the way we should go. What I am saying is, I think these effects are taking place. So whether you or I agree or not, resources, particularly where it's federal funding coming, start to dry up, or have already seen it drying up. Yes. Do you want to explain real quick patent box concept for? And some of the advantages there, would be that you keep the intellectual property, I guess, or parts of it in the country, as opposed to moving it offshore right away, which often happens, and therefore the exploitation. Right. And I guess that's one of the arguments for Irap or direct funding, that they say, no, you have to keep the rights inside of the country that funded it, or you got to pay us all our money back. Whereas SR&ED, hey, there's no real strings attached to that, so maybe that's a neat solution. Okay, so that, like I said, I'm not giving any opinions here. I might say I like this or I don't, but I'm not the deciding factor. I'm just. Excellent. So that'll probably pop up, like you said, other ideas. But, okay, just recapping the key issues on the wages then. Like we said, it's a hedge transaction, which is the big pro and argument for it. It creates Canadian wages, payroll. Quebec's been successful. The big con is timesheet issues. Do we, the review of it, how do we know what time is spent? And that's always an issue. Did you keep proper timesheets? Is the timesheet detailed enough? But again, probably not an issue that's insurmountable. It's pretty much addressed. Shifting the grants, we've talked about this, so I'll just recap it again. According to Jenkins' report, 73% of the survey claimants claim SR&ED. 17% claim Irap. So a huge disproportion. I'd say that's not even proportional to what I believe the real numbers are. I think vastly more SR&ED claimants than Irap claimants, just based on my experience. The other big push that they talked about there was venture capital. Maybe we should shift some money in venture capital because venture capitalists are so good at commercially exploiting stuff. I'm saying, well, this is even crazier. There's less than 1,000 venture capital deals funded every single year. And we say, well, SR&ED consultants charge too much. I went on the Venture Capital of Canada website, and the venture capitalist definition means they mean a minimum 40% return. And that's not even a good deal. Per year on the initial investment. Whatever they invest, they want 40% per year in perpetuity on that one lump sum that they gave you. So to go from 30,000 claimants to 1,000 a year that get funded one time, not even perpetually, I don't even know how you can make a comparison of that. Maybe venture capital is good and then shifting money to direct funding. Some of the arguments for the grants are it's more targeted, we can focus on social return, we can allow better budget control, we can allow government guys to pick the winners, decide what companies are going to succeed. But the arguments for tax credits are the business knows better than government, let the markets decide, avoids having politicians pick winners or exhibit any kind of favoritism to industries or whatnot. For the claimant, it's more predictable, wider reach, could be more accessible, and there's arguments on administrative costs. So again, there's no right or wrong on this, but issues that are being cited. This is an OECD study, and we'll look at another chart a little later on, that talks about Canada's funding and how much of it is direct or indirect. So Canada, they're saying here, as roughly 4 cents of every dollar. Canadian government funds 4% of BIRD, business expenditures on research and development. In the United States, it's closer to 12%, although the majority of it, we'll see from another chart, is direct funding. They just give you the grants, or they procurement, defense contracts, things like that. So again, to compare, as the Globe and Mail did, Canadian productivity on R&D incentives versus US, what they found is roughly for the 4% we put in versus the 12%, the productivity is roughly even. And I'm saying, well, if the productivity is roughly even, that means the credits are 3 times as effective as the grants. If 12% going on grants equals the same productivity as 4% going on credits, where's the argument that we should move it? We should move from the US system to our system, which seems to have less productivity for more money, or equal productivity for triple the amount of money. So I talked about the Microsoft Office, Corel Office. procurement. So the government's saying we should use contracts and grants to buy from Canadian companies first and put a focus on SR&ED. I don't really have any opinions on that. I'm just saying that's one of the big things that's being proposed, the Buy Canadian scheme as opposed to necessarily buy the best deal. I don't know how that's going to work, but like I said, maybe for Lotus and WordPerfect, that would have been a great example and a huge Canadian success story that otherwise died, and the government didn't have any mandate to do that. Maybe it's not a bad idea. Again, I don't know. When I talk about government grants, government procurement, my experience with government is that, despite what anyone say, I don't find it as honest and uncorrupted as some of you may purport. That's not been my experience. But that's just me. Venture capital, like we say, less than 1,000 deals a year, and every deal they want a minimum 40. They want to squeeze that company. They want to crush that company. If you ever deal with venture capitals, they're saying, I'm not talking to anyone who's not driven. You have to be willing to work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, or we don't want to invest in your company. And we want to drive the profits up. I think it's good for some companies on a growth curve, but it may be unrealistic to say that venture capital is really going to be the way to come in, and we're really putting all the eggs in very few baskets by doing that as opposed to free market forces. Okay? The filing deadline, like we say, if it's 30% of the cost of the CRA, then maybe that's a good area to look at cost-cutting measures. I don't really have an opinion on it one way or the other. I like the opportunity to go later, but if costs got to be cut, and that's the obvious obvious method to do a substantial cut without really negatively affecting the majority of claimants, maybe that's a neat avenue. Yes? Well, there's always the argument that we'll expand to use up whatever time and effort is necessary. But I mean, that's a budgetary thing or whatever. Right? There's always that chance. But I think if they give the right budgets and it's done judiciously, like the Harper government says, accountability of government is going to be, not only of the claimant, but of the government itself on its use of resources is going to be a big issue. The good ones. Well, that was a whole issue I didn't want to touch on whether there's an incentive for the CRA to reviewers to reduce the claims or whether that leads into their review evaluation. Understood. Any other issues on that? Reducing filing deadline? Like I say, this is one of the ones where the more we discuss it, people will tend to shift their opinions. And the way to look at it is, if we have to cut something, would that be the way? Then there's more acceptance. Versus, hey, let's not cut anything, which everyone's agreeable on. And like I say, using the CRA versus some new government agency, the part that offends me when people mention this is I'm saying, with the Canada Revenue Agency, if I don't agree with them, I go to the Tax Court of Canada, and I have law, and I have basically lawyers that decide the law is in or right. And I may not agree with the final decision, but at least I have a due process. I'm not aware of that due process. I can complain to the manager, like you said, but I don't have a right under law to get that money like I do with the SR&ED system. So again, there's a whole series of court procedures and precedents that have been built up, not only in our country, but for hundreds of years in other countries. And there's nothing similar in any grant system to match that. I don't know how you could compare the accountability of one of those systems to the other. It's apples and oranges to me. So I don't know. Any other feelings on who should administer that? Go ahead, bud. Yeah, has anyone had incidences where you've got an Irap project that didn't qualify for SR&ED? Have you ever had situations where the Irap project doesn't qualify for SR&ED or runs into problems on the SR&ED side? Has anyone seen that? That seems to be one of the big problems of our Irap clients, that they have an Irap funded project that Irap's all happy about, and SR&ED says, this is garbage, this doesn't qualify. I think there was a time where the Irap projects, they even asked you, was this an Irap project, which ones, and they tended to be put through the system, but I don't believe that's the case at all anymore on Irap projects. Our really rule with Irap is here's the 1-800 number, phone it and walk through. Here's what to expect. Well, there's all kinds of ways around it, I guess, if you really want to, but we'll leave that for another session. Okay, so here's a quick overview of what I said, what they call the elasticity or marginal utility of the credit, which is between 0.8 to 1 on average. Okay? All different studies, Canada, US, G7, Australia, that say for every dollar that goes in R&D credits, you roughly get half the dollar to $1.50 back. But it ignores, again, the social return, so that's the tax payback immediately just within the tax system. Most economists would say the social return for every dollar invested is 5 to 6. They compare something called the beta index. And the reason they look at the beta index is the beta index says how much money do you get from the tax credits, how much do we give you as a grant, which is a good thing. Business owners love tax credits, but business owners hate high tax rates. So if you give me a high tax credit, but I'm in a country with a high tax rate, well, that's a negative incentive. So what the beta index says is how much do you get in tax credits for every dollar, and then a denominator of 1 minus the tax rate. So higher your tax rate, the worse your beta index gets. The lower your beta index, the better. We can see that the beta index, the cost after taxes and incentives of doing R&D, is probably tops out in Italy for a small company, with Canada right behind. Very high beta index, very lucrative place to do R&D if we look at the tax scenarios. And even for larger companies. We'll just put that in perspective, but then a little later on we're going to go at the end and we're going to talk about how those breakdowns work between tax credits by the government and funding or grants. So we've talked about the U.S. collaboration versus confrontation, the opportunities for collaboration using the same form. We have identical rules. And regulation of fees for consultant support. So here we go into it. We'll talk a little bit more. Like I said, maybe I want to leave this to the end where we talk a little bit more about recent challenges in the U.S. because they restrict contingency fees. They say consultants aren't allowed to use contingency fees. 0, period there. You have to charge other than a contingency fee if you do R&D tax credits in the U.S. And I talk to people who do it, and they explain the methods that they use, and I say, but that's just the contingency fee. You've just made it more complicated to hide the fact that it's a contingency fee. Oh, well, that's the way it works in the U.S. I can say, well, I'll charge you $5,000 an hour. And I'll run up a fee to whatever I want. But I'll say, but I'll warranty my work. If you don't get your credits, I'll just write my fee off. Because you can't make me not warranty my work. But isn't that a contingency fee? I don't know. Now we're going to have to hire armies of auditors to audit how we charge the fees before we can even get into reviewing the SR&ED. So we're going to need more resources to audit the red tape of what we're doing, how we're charging fees before we even get into it. I think that's just completely off base on the intent and spirit of the program. Okay? So this is basically recently in Globe and Mail, Minister Goodyear basically says, I'm not concerned about what cartons charge for their everyday business. My concern is simply that the money moves out of the science and into other area of our economy. So they've had recent discussions Stakeholders meetings with CRA. I was in one a few weeks ago. I think some people went to Ottawa on it and talked about it. They quote a partner from Deloitte's saying the top 6 accounting firms in Canada earned $117 million in 2010 from SR&ED. If we can assume that they represent the majority of the guys who get the $2 billion, those 4,000 large companies, doesn't seem like the credits are overly high percentage. 117 million on 2 billion, and that's just the federal credits. We don't know what the provincials are, say 3 billion. It's not really that high a percentage. Could be less, but I don't think it's extortional or really taking too much money out of the system here. We're talking at 5%. Okay. He says could override aggressive practices by banning contingency fees and requiring registration of all consultants. Does anyone think that's a good idea? I guess my main issue is I don't always agree with the CRA. I challenge them if I think they're wrong and say I want to go to tax court and settle it. So could they say, well, you don't agree with everything we say, so you're not who authorizes the consultants? The CRA is going to do it? Isn't that like having the wolf, guard the steak? Who's going to then protect the client in tax court if they needed to be represented because the CRA is not following the law? And it happens all the time. I can go through case after case where the taxpayer wins. What's an aggressive practice would be my concern. Well, that'd be the question. Do contingency practice create overly aggressive claims? Are they the cause of it? Or is that just a unlinked scenario? Julie? Well, my firm works on all bases. We'll work hourly, flat fee, or contingent, and we think that the client should have the right to pick the fee that best works for them, that the government shouldn't tell the business owner how to run his or her business. I have... One of the questions in the stakeholders meeting that CRA had is, does anyone want to talk about what fees they're charging? And there was just silence in the room. 20 of us, nobody said a single thing. They just sat there listening. So a lot of people keep that private. I mean, I can say our firm posts that our rate's 20% right on our engagement letter on our website. So I can't really go different than that, but it could go down below that. And my experience is I've seen guys who 3 years ago were charging 35% that are now doing it for 10, the same job. I think a lot of it is that the manufacturing research has shrunk, and there's a same number of people going after 20% of the market that was there before, and the answer is cut cost. I'll cut my cost to a third of what I did before just to stay alive. I don't talk to any consultants that are making more money now than 2 years ago. It's very hard, I find, too, when I look at this issue. It becomes more and more complicated the more people I talk to. So, for instance, I talk to consultants who say, we have a lot of money. We'll give you half of the SR&ED money up front when we file your claim. How do you add a value to that? Or we'll deal with patent lawyers and attorneys to help you commercially exploit the product as part of our fee, because we've already got a lot of legwork. How do you attribute, like, is that part of the SR&ED? How do you charge for that? It's often part of the contingency fee, but again, you really have to define what services you're looking at to say what's a fair price for that, because the more I start looking at this, I get hit with all these kinds of issues, and I say, wait, this is going to be a monster to try to manage or control something like that. All right. Oh, sorry, Harvey, yes. Let her rip. I knew this would be a hot issue. I don't know if it's Machiavellian at that level, but we'll see. I'm not sure the intent. My personal feeling is just let the market decide. And if the fees are high, it's because the client perceives it as complicated. Simplify the rules, and people will never overpay for any kind of fee. I can tell you, I negotiate with clients all the time. Nobody wants to pay more than the market will bear. And they're always telling me, I got this guy, and this guy who are going to do it for this much. And that's it. It's a competitive marketplace. I don't think, and whether it's contingent or flat fee or hourly, doesn't really make any difference. They're looking at the bottom line, what you got them and what they got, and the effort that it took. Okay. This is a study that I found back from the 90s. I don't know how relevant it is, But it basically said that the mean cost versus the median was 15 to 30% what they paid consultants for claims under $200,000. This was way back in 1994. I had this study on compliance costs. As the claims go to larger companies, the compliance costs went down significantly. So even though the compliance cost might be on a mean, close to 10%, I would say it's almost all the little guys, the SM, small and medium-sized enterprise. If we go back to my statistics, they're only 1/3 of total claimants. So when the Globe and Mail publishes an article that 1/3 of all the credits go to consultants, I'm saying that's not only false, that's irresponsible journalism. That's just flat-out lies that aren't even realistic, and it's published in a national newspaper. So those raise concerns because that's what the public sees, and they're the ones who are voting. So the people that are making these decisions are often talking to people like that, not necessarily people that have any background on what we're talking about here, or even real facts. Ombudsman report. So I won't spend much time on this other than it dragged on for I don't know how many years, and everyone's, when's the Ombudsman report coming out? In particular, there was 5 questions that they asked. None of them which were even addressed in the Ombudsman report, so I'm not sure really what the report was about. But they said they didn't receive any complaints that they could substantiate, not a single one. But there may be some minor inconsistency they admit in how the program's administered. And what they said is, if you read the CRA ICs and ITs and understand them, then there won't be any consistencies. People just haven't read the rules. So a lot of the complaints I think were shoved under the table, and I talked to people who said, no, I filed very specific complaints, and they didn't address them. This is a flat-out lie. I don't know who to believe on that one. Maybe their complaint wasn't as well written as they thought it was. I haven't seen it, so I don't really know how to comment. But really all they said is they admitted that one of the weaknesses, some RTAs simply state, claim did not meet the criteria of the Income Tax Act. Period. And they're saying, we recommend that that's not enough. They should try to explain a little more why. Give me a hint. So again, it's kind of like taking your car to the mechanic and saying it doesn't work. I mean, they're going to ask, what do you mean? What happens when you turn the keys? Oh, it turns over. Oh, it drives fine. You let them go half an hour. There's a knocking noise on the left. I say, why didn't you just tell me that in the first place? If you know specifically what's wrong or give me a hint, it's going to save you a lot of time and money. Don't give vague answers. It's not R&D for one reason, but I'm not going to tell you the reason so you can't address it. Again, I think if you've dealt with Jackson. So the 5 questions that they asked here, I think these are still relevant, and they lead to kind of our contingency fee questions here. Did the CRA adequately inform taxpayers about recent changes? Has the cost of filing or defending a claim changed? Whatever. Did CRA accept requests for second opinion? Did they review and audit your claim in a professional manner? And number 5, the big one, has the CRA or any person attempted to dissuade you from retaining professional advice? Kind of like you don't need a consultant. I remember actually, because I don't attend any of the technical reviews or financial reviews, I tell my client how to do it. They would tell me for about a 2-year period that almost every review, the reviewer would say, you don't need these consultants. Why don't you do it on your own? You don't need anyone. Actively. And I mean, it wasn't once. It was constantly. Almost every client, almost every time. I was shocked at this. So worse than this, when they did this, they said, oh, and this is only after February 2107. So anything that happened up to that point, that doesn't count. We only want to know about complaints after this date. So again, I think they started to cut that policy out from whatever mandate that was given from and say maybe consultants fit in here somehow. But I would say this idea of, hey, consultants are bad like Harvey says and they're all a bunch of crooks, this isn't a new position of the CRA. I've faced this since I started 20 years ago, and CRA is kind of your friend at one time, and at other times maybe not. I don't know where to go with it. I just follow the law. And that's really all that's required at the end of the day. Okay. How do you deal with this? The fact that you're posting complaints and they're saying, no, we didn't receive any. I'm saying maybe there's a secretive nature to the Ombudsman report where everything's in there, and this should be done, maybe the complaint should be made public. Maybe we need a different form of ombudsman where we can all read each other's complaints and see if we agree or not, that it's not so secretive. I'm always saying if something's wrong, shine a light on it. People who are doing things properly, they can is really the best way to get the justice, I say. Not keeping things secret and making decisions behind closed doors. So, your feelings on ombudsman, Russ? Effectiveness? All right, well, you seem to support what I'm saying, that people have told me they've made submissions. I haven't seen them, but... I didn't read that one. All right, so I think the general consensus is we waited 5 years for the Ombudsman report, and it was disappointing for everyone who was waiting on it because it basically said CRA is golden, they're doing nothing wrong. If people have problems, they didn't read the CRA papers clearly. Okay, CRA issues on administration. So at January 11th, 2012, CRA conference for Ontario practitioners at the Royal Botanical Gardens, the Director General at the time, Susan Betts, said, here's the 5 main problems of a CRA study, both from an industry perspective and from the CRA perspective. Say the big complaints on industry of the CRA that pop up over and over and over again are, number 1, you sent the wrong RTA. He or she doesn't have the right experience in my field of science. I see this popping up again. A narrowing of the eligibility criteria, complexity of the process and forms, documentation too onerous. Those 3 middle ones I think are your consistent claims that everyone's going to have. And the outcomes from year to year lack consistency. So you accept 100% of everything for the last 6 years, and now you're telling me nothing's in. And we've written it the same way as before. And I don't know if anyone else has seen that happen, but that's happened to a few claimants I've seen, and they come to me and say, whoa, what the heck just happened? Maybe we need a different view on this. Anyways, view from industry. I would say that, a lot of the bottom 4 are kind of supportable, that they're just really applying the criteria more rigorously than they were before. I don't know if it's narrowing. It's the same criteria, but they may have let stuff go in the past that they're not letting go anymore. That's my experience. The RTA is not qualified to correctly assess. Has anyone run into that issue? Do you want to, without mentioning anything, do you want to give a quick overview, or if you think that's prevalent, or we don't want to state any specific names or anything, but. Mm. Or at least applied mathematics at that point, right? I've seen certain situations, and I often get involved on claims where they come to me after. They got in a big fight, and they're not getting what they want, and they want a second opinion on it. And I would say my experience, and I've actually, in many cases, I think their client, hey, I think you're right. The guy that they applied, or he or she doesn't have the appropriate skills or whatever, or background. And when I complain to the assistant director or the head, you know what they've told me? You don't really need to understand that science to be able to do a science review. No, they've said this, And I said, are you joking? And they said, no, once you understand science, you can pretty much do anything. And I listened to them, and these are the heads of the department. I said, no wonder this is the #1 complaint of industry. If the heads of the department think like that, holy smoke, what hope do we have of getting the right reviewer assigned? So anyways, I don't think this is a unique, yeah, go ahead. Huh? Yep, so I mean, I could tell you horror stories too, and I'm sure we all have those, but one of the other problems that I've had where I said, okay, I don't think you have the appropriate training in the field, but that's okay, there's a guidance paper. Let's look at the examples, or there's a tax court case on the technical issues really relevant to this. Let's take a look at those and compare them to the client situations so we can explain why the client feels the basis that they're in. I've been told by them, we have no requirement to address any specific CRA issues in their guidance documents, and definitely we're not going to discuss anything that's tax precedents. So you can't use any examples or information that we've published to support your case. If we say we don't see the technological advancement and leave it at full point, that's it. You can't win. Yes? Well, that was something actually Russ and I were talking about a little bit before, is some kind of arbitration process or industry parties or someone arm's length objective that can give not only a second review, but a timely second review. The biggest complaints are not only the review, but the year or two it takes to actually get it back on track. Right. And you get stuck in that hole. Actually, we might have to, can we push it to the end just because we got a few more issues to hit by 6 o'clock? Sure, go ahead. Well, let me go back on that. Isn't there a... But I think the CRA RTAs are experts. They're not tax people. They don't have financial training. They're experts in their field of science or technology. And they actually have the NTSS. Well, isn't the vision, Russ, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the National Technology NTSS sector specialists are exactly that. You're a specialist in that field of science or technology, and they correlate with the fields that you have to choose. So the idea is you should have someone that matches your field of science, not just someone who happens to be in your geographical area that's nearby that can review you. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. Like I say, the number one complaint of industry, RTA is not qualified to do it, leading basically to all the other situations down there. Yes? Sure. An interesting point when I look at the IRS rules is they have for the reviews, or audits they call them down there, a rebuttal clause saying if the reviewer wants to knock it out, they have to prove that the solution was there. They have to prove it. They have to show you where the answer was and accessible to you. There's nothing like that up here. I think that's a great idea. Yeah. I think that's great accountability. All right, moving along just so we can wrap it up because we spent a little extra time on this one. But now from the CRA's perspective, because we've already tarnished them, they're fighting back. They're saying, well, here's the 5 things they don't like. Number 1, I found this one kind of funny, personal attacks against CRA staff. And I've talked to different directors who say they've had physical attacks on reviewers, verbal attacks on reviewers, you name it. So again, that's not proper. I'm not knowing what skewed people to those levels, but number 1 complaint, and usually it's verbal attacks, but you want it to keep things professional. To me, that says maybe there's a breakdown in communication at the same time. Okay? Insufficient information to allow a desk review. I can appreciate that. You want to see the details there. This is a CRA comment, though. This isn't even the government or legislative people. CRA saying success billings unfairly benefits from claimants. So somehow they're privy to what those rates are. And if that's the case, if the CRA knows what those rates are, we should be asking them what are the average rates, because none of the practitioners seem to be volunteering that information. Increasingly aggressive claims, which kind of ties in here. And then one that I really agree with, that I think that, and the Globe and Mail article outlined it. It was just really one firm that was going up and down every street and filing a claim for everyone. Hey, you got a 7-Eleven, we'll fire it. Gas station, who cares? If it doesn't stick, we'll just withdraw it. And that was wasting CRA resources. They were fraudulent claims, I mean, at the best. And really, what CRA's done is it's got rid of that problem by just saying we'll file penalties or prosecute people, and I imagine those went away. So it was a brief moment in time where that occurred. It was a blip with one company doing it, as far as I know, and the issues tend to go away. Any other issues on that? Some of the recommendations that I've heard are the CRA's talking about developing at least one project example per industry. And I hear they're working on that now in Ottawa. Better examples. They say right now there's 128 different examples of all different industries. None of them would really pass CRA scrutiny, if you ask me. There's not one existing example I'm saying, that's a good project description. I would be proud to submit that on my client's behalf. No way. And really the arguments here are, like we said, provide some method to settle disputes fairly with skilled scientists in a timely manner, 30 or 60 days or less. Not 6 months, 9 months, 2 years, where an issue drags on and starts to affect future claims and holds everything up. The length of time seems to be one of the big complaints I see with clients as much as the final decision. They say, decide one way or the other just so we can move on and continue business. We don't want to continue putting resources into something that's dragging on forever. There was a draft policy on eligibility to work back in June. Comments on that. The core problem seems to be what the CRA calls technological advancement, and them outlining, what they'd like to see to make sure that occurs. We recommend a multi-part process. One of the things that I'm saying, claims that have fallen short and we've been able to bring back had weaknesses in one of 5 key areas. Number one is they didn't benchmark standard practice. They say this is the first of a kind in the world, but they didn't say here's how many articles we found, here's how many patents we looked at, or competitive methods, or anything. And the more you do up front to say we don't think there's an off-the-shelf solution, the better. Your due diligence or whatever you want to call it. And there's no right or wrong on this. It could be 10 minutes, it could be 10 hours, it could be 10 weeks. It really depends on the size of the project and the state of the science at the start. They fail to provide quantifiable objectives. The tax courts reiterate, systematic investigation must involve extremely accurate measurement and subsequent analysis of those measurements. They say without such measurement and analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist. If you don't provide lots of quantifiables, you're going to have a hard time illustrating systematic investigation if you're not providing numbers. Really the pivotal point of the ones that I think cause the problems are not only talking about what the uncertainties are, but what we found when push comes to shove is that a real scientist can prove they know the science by talking about the variables of uncertainty. I.e., what are the things under my control that I can change? The X, Y, Z. If I change temperature, I may change pressure. I may change glass fiber content. So there's 3 variables all under my control where changing one may have an unpredictable upstream or downstream effect on the other. The clients who can sit there and say, here's actually the variables, the things that we're experimenting with, I think really don't run into all those other problems that the CRA is talking about, because the rest of the documentation is how many different alternatives did you look at, how are they different, what methods did you use, how did the results compare to your objectives, and more importantly, how did you conclude on those variables. And if any one of those 5 components is missing, the CRA will argue there's no technological advancement. And they will be correct, or there's a part of it missing. But my corollary argument is if all 5 parts of those are there, then it's back to the CRA to prove where I'm wrong, that the information was readily available and I just didn't find it. And I think that creates a somewhat objective process. There's always going to be subjectivity involved, but it allows you to quickly pinpoint where the likely problem areas are. Okay? No. Talked about those ones. Okay, and intellectual collaboration, so one other thing, crowdfunding. So this is a non-SR&ED issue, but a very popular one. Really in the States, it's really got some new legislation going, and I don't know where it is. It's in the Senate or somewhere in there. But really what they're talking about, but basically what they're saying is they allow small companies to get direct investment from investors, no stock market involved, and protect the investor by saying it's got to be less than $10,000 and 10% of the investor's annual income to protect low-income or non-sophisticated investors. And maybe that'll stretch. I think this is a great opportunity for commercialization and allowing a new form of funding. It's probably going to come in the U.S. I talked to Russ a little bit about it because Canada's big on pushing it as well, and maybe something that we'll see in the near future. Anything else on that, Russ? The real argument here is it will allow the government to create a scenario where companies can get money for R&D without using government funds. So the government could create a framework, but it's got to protect really the investor, and that's the downside. Well, and part of the argument is there's not enough money for commercialization. We do the research. We need some people to put in more funding for commercialization. So hopefully we'll see that coming here. There's talks about that coming in. Again, protecting the public, like you said. Yeah. All right, changes in the budget. So we talked about all these changes that are coming, and then the budget came, and really nothing. I said, well, that was minor. But what they've announced, so the federal ITC rate going down for the big guys, but maybe we'll see refundability or something coming on the flip side. Who knows? A lot of talk about that. Subcontractor expenses, kind of along the Quebec model, that they said, well, probably 20% of what you pay the subcontractors related to ineligible expenses, prescribed expenses, rent for buildings, stuff like that wouldn't be eligible. Fine. Reducing the proxy rate, phasing it in over the years. Again, a lot of people saw that coming. They thought the 65% was too high. And the big one is the elimination of capital equipment at 2014. But going back to the, hey, if we have to eliminate something, wages, materials, contractors, capital equipment, most people said if you've got to pick something, go with the materials and the capital equipment. Don't touch the wages for all the reasons we talked about. So again, if we have to be fiscally responsible, maybe that's the way to go. Okay. Quick talk about some recent tax cases. Murray Arlen was a dentist here, probably doing really eligible research, a PhD kind of guy, university professor. And the problem here was he had a real neat system that kept track of dental implants, we're told. 200 different variables about every implant. He only used 50 of them. He had 12,000 patients. And he would look for cause and effect relationships, hypothesis. And he went to court, and the problem was not on the research itself. And I actually work with some of his associates, so it's a small world. I'm familiar with the kind of work that they do. But the question became, in the courts, CRA said, you can't get a claim because you don't have a hypothesis. And the courts actually said, you don't really need a hypothesis as long as you've identified the variables. So what is the hypothesis became a whole issue. And in the US, the IRS says you have to have a hypothesis. If you don't have a hypothesis, it's not R&D. I would strongly recommend in Canada you should still have a hypothesis, idea or theory of the way that you want to go. But we'll talk about hypothesis itself. Okay, and quickly the provincial updates. So we're told that Dr. Arlen used a program called Triton. Had 200 different variables about dental implants. He used 50 in his analysis. 12,000 patient records. The problem was when he went to court, he says that he spent every Friday theorizing about stuff, but he didn't keep any notes. He didn't write anything down. He didn't say, here's some queries that I ran out of the system to see if there's a correlation between this and that or anything. He probably did these things, but he kept it all up here. And the sole evidence that I'm told in the court papers that he brought to court was an article that he published in 2007 in a medical journal to support his work for 2007 and 2008. Saying, well, what's wrong with that picture? And the judge said the same thing. She said, I believe you probably did the eligible research, but you can't just do it all in your head. You have to keep some records, notes, something, exports of what's happened. And again, this is one of the ones where there probably was eligible research performed. It was purely a documentation issue. I'm not really privy on it. If anyone wants to comment on that, I know you probably know more than I do, Julie, but it's one of those ones that was likely SR&ED, but this is the question. How much documentation is reasonable? How far should we drill? I could argue that, hey, we have all these logs in here, and we can prove we've got the medical records. The question is, how do we prove what we analyze? What were the things we were doing every Friday? What queries or questions were we doing that addressed the technological uncertainty? And to look back at a report that was done at the start of it versus at the end of it, probably, although a positive indicator, the judge said just wasn't enough to say that I believe that every single Friday, like you said, you spend as much time as you said because there's really no evidence, specific evidence of what you've done. So again, it's one of those ones that gets a little tricky, that probably the advancements are there, the theory's there, there's records that would be a good basis of data for the analysis. It was just the evidence of analysis, from what I know, just reading what the tax court transcript said on what happened. Go ahead.
One or other of the hypotheses. And we won on that. The judge said you can't be so narrow to say you need to document exactly what you were thinking about when you collected the exact piece of data related to the specific hypothesis. But he had several hypotheses because he was looking for various trends throughout the year. And so he couldn't delineate the exact data related to the exact, which required us to show advancement in knowledge and uncertainty. We didn't have to show technological output. But they refer to the parts of the IC, whatever, 86 or the related to specific hypothesis related to experimentation, that you have to have a hypothesis first. But he wasn't experimenting. He was advancing knowledge through analysis. So he didn't have to show that he was experimenting. You only have to show you need to show that you have a specific hypothesis if you're experimenting. You wasn't experimenting. So the whole reason he was denied in the first place was wrong. Then we got to court, and they're like, well, where are all the records? Well, the records are in the thing. So we didn't drag the database and all the data and all the records. So then the judge was left, unfortunately, with a minimal amount of evidence. CRA and the judge said most likely was SR&ED, just was unsubstantiated. So people understand this case is not about experimentation. It's not about whether you need to have data for a specific hypothesis. It was just an unfortunate chain of events where it was denied for the wrong reason in the first place and didn't have the perfect records for tax court. So whatever what the lesson here is, you need to have good records for the tax court. So don't get denied in the first place. But if they're citing the wrong policy in the field, they have to go to tax court. So kind of complicated case, but the idea was you have interrelated hypothesis. How do you specifically say in a clinical research a specific piece of data is related to a specific hypothesis? If you were testing for cancer, you would never say that. You would collect a large volume of data related to a cancer study, and no one would say, well, the data that you collected on Thursday, was that related to a specific hypothesis for cancer, or were you just trying to cure cancer? Right? They would never ask you to be that. So with CRA's position in the field, they would have reduced the amount of data down to 2% of the data. But he felt that he needed a large volume of data in order to make conclusions. And this is what the tax court does. So controversial subject. If anybody wanted to ever talk to me about the Mariano case, please talk to me about it.
And what I did is I put together a quick list of things that might be eligible. So very often when you talk about that kind of work, you have different kinds of hypotheses. One of them in the medical field is a null hypothesis. And this is very common in those kinds of studies, even in big pharma studies or whatever. Hypothesis, this doesn't have any effect, or these things don't have an effect. They're not. It's easier to prove something does, but a null hypothesis, often in medicine or pharmaceuticals, what you're doing is, we don't think these things do correlate. How do you prove that? Again, Same method. You have different principles. You test for differences. They talk about directionality. Am I proving something does exist or proving something doesn't exist? So again, that can affect the whole design of your sample, your testing process and your sample size. I've listed in the letter some of the test statistics that they can use for determining things. And I'm saying, typically I ask the clients, do you know what a one sample versus a paired test are? Z-test, T-tests. How did you do this? Do you do a chi-squared test? If they know what these things are and they say, well, this doesn't apply here, I use this one, we're in. Those kind of tests will then drive our sample sizes, which again will be something very understandable, I found, for the courts and the judge to say, yes, this person identified the criteria we want for CRA, SR&ED, and we can assess as it stands. So it's really a matter of how do I find what information is applicable out of whatever the client has. If they don't keep good notes or notebooks, and obviously try to get them on side in future. Yes. I'm not sure. I'm of the position that it's always good to have a hypothesis. So. I think quickly we also should caveat that this was an informal procedure. It wasn't a full tax court procedure, which means we didn't have all the opportunities in numerous dates that we would have to, hey, we'll come back tomorrow with all the stuff. Informal procedure, they went in and out and it's done. So you got to nail it one shot. And as a result of that, you put a lower level of emphasis on informal procedures versus a full general procedure, but still an indicator, lessons to be learned on there. Real quick, provincial updates. Manitoba ITC, they've increased the refundability of it. Saskatchewan, it's cut back its refundability, so provinces tend to be going in different ways. No big deal there. International credits for R&D, and we'll reiterate in the last section, charging of some new developments, really in the U.S. on contingency fees, and a tax case. So this is all dealing with international issues. So for those who are interested, we have the OECD definition of a qualified project. And if we compare those to the CRA rules, they're pretty much verbatim. The basic applied research, experimental development, and the 4 phases: objectives, variables of uncertainty, systematic investigation. Comparing country to country, so we talked about this earlier, and I just stuck this last chart in, that we talk about direct funding. So countries like Russia, if we look, almost all the funding is direct. Grants or direct procurement with the claimant. If we go down the list, USA, again, most of the money, they have a slight amount of tax credits. As we get into France, one of the countries that's got a fair amount of tax credit, higher proportion of tax credits, just like Korea, Belgium, and as we get down the list, we can get down to Canada here, which, when you look, arguably we have the highest proportion of tax credits to direct funding of any of those countries, which is one of the criticisms. On the flip side, a lot of people are saying it's actually working more effectively, that we put less money in total and we actually get equal productivity to some of the larger ones who invest considerably more funds, but directly. Okay, some of the issues we talked about as well. How do we define contingency services? What if we don't just do SR&ED? What if we have technical tax work, IP? What if you work on the funding? How do you define the engagement? Do you have to split the SR&ED out from the rest? How would you do that? What is a contingent fee? Like I say, if I say, oh, it's not contingent, but I'm going to charge you $2,000 an hour, and if you don't get your money, I'll write my fee off. Is that contingent, or is that just me warranting my fee? Now our lawyers can argue with my lawyers, and we can get a big war about what a fee is and whether it's contingent. I mean, that's really a distraction from the key issue. And just recently, in the last month, Ryan LLC in the U.S. has filed a constitutional challenge to the IRS on the legality, saying it's illegal for you to tell us we can't charge our client contingent fees. They're basically saying it's the client's right to decide how they want to do it. And you may see changes to Circular 230 in the U.S., which is the one that bans the contingent fees. The IRS may back off on that as a result. And it's a constitutional challenge, so it's going through the D.C. courts right now. Other international issues. Pricewaterhouse was a trustee for a company called BagTech, and this issue keeps popping up and flip-flopping back and forth. And basically, they have more than 50% of the shareholders as foreign, and yet they got CCPC status, saying that they have a unanimous shareholders agreement, which restricts the rights of the foreign owners, so it gives control to Canada. And I mean, I've seen this on other cases like Perfect Fry going way back, and the courts flip-flop on this. This issue's been around for 20 years, and I'd say it's still unsettled. It's tipping here to say, whoa, maybe we'd be in, but I'd say there's sections of the Act, 256, if you read them really closely, I think maybe the judge made the wrong decision on this one from my knowledge of it. I'm not going to comment any further because I don't have all the facts, but something in there. What's a Canadian-controlled private corporation and what's not? I think one of the best cases was a case called Mimitex Pharmaceuticals, which was a de facto control test where I agreed with this one. A U.S. director owned 50% of the company, and two Canadian, when the CRA reviewer came out, it became privy to him or her that the U.S. director down in California during the year had done certain transactions like firing the head of R&D and replacing him with someone else, a few other transactions, without asking the concurrency of the director. Not, hey, I want to fire the head of R&D. Do 182 concur? He's gone. He just did it. And unfortunately, both the CRA and the Tax Court of Canada thought that was clear evidence of factual control or de facto control. So even though he didn't have voting control, he was deemed to control the company. They lost their $230,000 in refunds. So, like I say, these cases will flip back and forth, but it's a hot issue, particularly where you got foreign ownership, and something that I think is going to remain kind of in flux for a little bit, especially on cases like this that tend to go